Disaster forced them to beg for her help. The boulder crashed down the mountainside, sending villagers scattering in every direction. Dust exploded into the air as the massive rock shattered against the stone wall of the grain storage, missing it by mere inches. Hearts pounding, the villagers turned to see where the boulder had come from, their faces pale with terror. But amid the chaos, one figure stood calm, a small woman barely reaching the shoulders of those around her. Her name was Amara, and while everyone else panicked, her eyes were already tracing the mountain's edge, calculating, thinking. "It's just a rock slide," someone muttered nervously. "Nothing to worry about." But Amara knew better. She had seen the cracks forming in the mountain face for weeks now. She had tried to warn them, but as always, no one listened to someone her size. "Look at her, standing there like she knows something." A tall man named Gregor laughed, nudging his companion. "What's she going to do? Stack herself on top of someone to reach the problem?" The crowd erupted in laughter. It was the same laughter Amara had heard her entire life, sharp, cutting, meant to diminish. She was used to it by now, but that didn't make it hurt any less. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked away, her small frame disappearing into the narrow alleyways of the village. This was her life in Thornvale, a village nestled at the foot of Graystone Mountain, where height was equated with strength and strength with worth. At barely 4.5 feet tall, Amara had been judged worthless from the day she was born. Her parents had died when she was young, leaving her to fend for herself in a community that saw her as nothing more than a burden, a joke, a person to be pitied or mocked, but never respected. Every morning she woke before dawn to tend the small herb garden behind her tiny cottage at the village's edge. While others slept, she gathered medicinal plants, studied the weather patterns, and observed the mountain that loomed over them all. She had taught herself to read the land, to understand the subtle warnings nature provided. But when she tried to share her knowledge, the villagers would pat her head like a child or simply walk away mid-sentence. "Amara thinks she's so smart," she once heard a woman say at the market, reading her little books, collecting her little plants, as if any of that matters when you can't even reach the top shelf. The woman's friends had giggled, and Amara had pretended not to hear. But she kept preparing anyway, because Amara had learned something the villagers hadn't. Size didn't determine wisdom, and strength came in many forms. The morning after the boulder incident, Amara noticed something that made her blood run cold. The creek that ran through the village was running muddy, thick with sediment. The birds had stopped singing in the trees near the mountain. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. These weren't isolated signs. They were connected, pieces of a puzzle the villagers were too arrogant to see. She approached the village council that afternoon, her heart racing, but her voice steady. The 5 council members sat on their elevated platform in the town square, looking down at anyone who came before them, literally looking down in Amara's case. "Council members," she began, her voice clear despite her nervousness. "I believe we're in danger. The mountain is unstable. The rock slide yesterday wasn't random. It's a warning. I've seen the cracks spreading, the water changing, the animals fleeing. We need to evacuate the homes closest to the mountain and prepare emergency shelters." Council leader Marcus leaned back in his chair, a condescending smile playing on his lips. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man who'd held his position for 20 years through intimidation and inherited wealth rather than actual competence. "And what exactly would someone like you know about mountain stability? Have you climbed to the top to inspect it? Oh, wait, you probably couldn't make it past the first ridge." The other council members snickered. One of them, a woman named Helena, actually had to cover her mouth to hide her laughter. "I've studied the patterns," Amara insisted, her fists clenched at her sides. "I've documented the changes for 3 months. Please, just look at my notes." "We don't have time for fairy tales," Marcus interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "The mountain has stood for thousands of years. It'll stand for thousands more. Now run along, little one. The adults have real business to discuss." Amara's face burned with humiliation as laughter echoed around the square. She turned and walked away, her notes clutched to her chest, feeling the weight of every mocking stare on her back. "Should we even let her speak at council meetings? It's embarrassing, really," she heard Helena say behind her. That night, Amara didn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the mountain by moonlight, seeing the subtle shifts in shadow that indicated further instability. She prepared her emergency supplies: rope, dried food, medical herbs, tools. If the disaster came, she would be ready, even if no one else was. The disaster came 3 days later, and it came with a vengeance. It started with a sound like thunder, but thunder that didn't stop. The ground began to shake, gently at first, then violently. Amara was already outside when the first screams started. She looked up to see the impossible. A massive section of Graystone Mountain was sliding downward, a churning wall of rock, mud, and debris heading straight for Thornvale. The mudslide moved with terrifying speed, consuming trees and boulders like they were nothing. The village erupted into chaos. People ran in every direction, screaming, crying, grabbing children and possessions. The mudslide hit the outer homes first, crushing them like paper, the thick sludge pouring through streets and alleys. "The bridge!" someone screamed. "Get to the bridge!" But Amara could see what they couldn't. The bridge was directly in the mudslide's path. Anyone who ran there would be trapped, cut off, buried alive. "No!" she shouted, running into the panicking crowd. "Not the bridge! Head east to the high ground by the old oak forest." But her voice was small, lost in the chaos. No one heard her. No one listened. She watched in horror as dozens of villagers ran toward the bridge, Marcus and Helena leading the way, their faces twisted with fear. The mudslide would reach them in minutes. They were all going to die. Unless someone did something. Amara ran. Her short legs carried her faster than anyone would have expected, her small size letting her dart through narrow gaps in the panicking crowd. She reached the bell tower, the village's emergency warning system, but the ladder was far too high for her to reach normally. She didn't hesitate. Years of climbing in her garden, of reaching for things others placed too high, of adapting to a world not built for her size, had made her resourceful. She dragged a crate over, then another, stacking them with shaking hands. She climbed, jumped, caught the ladder's bottom rung, and pulled herself up with every ounce of strength she had. Her arms screamed in protest, her muscles burning, but she kept climbing. Up and up, higher than she'd ever climbed, until she reached the bell. She grabbed the rope and pulled with all her might, again and again, the deep booming sound cutting through the chaos like a knife. Bong, bong, bong. The emergency bell. 3 strikes meant change direction. Everyone in Thornvale knew that signal. The villagers running toward the bridge paused, confusion crossing their faces. The bell rang again. Bong, bong, bong. "High ground!" Amara screamed from the tower, her voice amplified by the bell chamber's acoustics. "East, to the oak forest! The bridge is a death trap!" For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Marcus looked back and saw what Amara had seen. The mudslide was bearing down on the bridge, which was already cracking under the pressure of the churning debris. "She's right!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with terror. "East, everyone, east!" The crowd changed direction, a churning mass of panicked humanity now following Amara's guidance. She climbed down from the tower, her hands bleeding, her body shaking with adrenaline. But there was no time to rest. The mudslide was still coming, and not everyone had heard the bell. She ran through the village, her lungs burning, directing stragglers, pulling children from the path of danger, her voice hoarse from shouting. An elderly man had fallen in the street, too weak to stand. The mud was only yards away. Amara didn't think. She grabbed his arm and pulled with surprising strength, dragging him toward safety. She was small, but desperation and determination made her strong enough. A younger man saw her struggling and rushed to help, together lifting the elderly man and carrying him to higher ground. By the time the mudslide finished its terrible journey, it had consumed a third of Thornvale's buildings, including the bridge, the grain storage, and the council hall. The destruction was catastrophic, but every single person had made it to safety because of a bell tower and the small woman who had climbed it when no one else was thinking clearly. The survivors gathered in the oak forest, muddy, exhausted, traumatized. As the reality of what had happened and what could have happened sank in, faces began to turn toward Amara. She sat on a fallen log, wrapping her bleeding hands with strips of cloth, her whole body trembling with exhaustion. Marcus approached her slowly, his expensive clothes ruined with mud, his arrogant bearing completely shattered. He stopped a few feet away, unable to meet her eyes. You tried to warn us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Amara didn't respond immediately. She finished bandaging her hands, taking her time, letting him stand there with his shame. Finally, she looked up at him. "Yes," she said simply, "I did." "If we had listened," Helena stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "If we had listened, we could have evacuated days ago. We could have saved the buildings, the supplies. Oh God, we almost killed everyone because we were too arrogant to—" Her voice broke and she covered her face with her hands. Others began to approach, one by one. The woman in the market who had mocked her, Gregor who had laughed at her size, families whose children she had pulled from danger. They came with shame and gratitude warring on their faces, not knowing what to say, how to apologize for years of cruelty. "We need your help," Marcus finally said, the words clearly painful for him. "Please, we need you to lead us, to help us survive this. We don't know what to do." Amara looked around at the faces around her, the same faces that had laughed at her, dismissed her, treated her less than human for her entire life. Part of her wanted to refuse, to let them feel the helplessness she had felt every day. But a larger part of her, the part that had run into danger to save them despite everything, wouldn't allow it. "First," she said, standing up despite her exhaustion, "we need clean water. The creek is contaminated with mud and debris. There's a spring higher up the mountain, beyond where the slide occurred. We'll need teams to carry water." She pulled out the notes she had tried to show the council days ago, now mud-stained but still readable. "Second, we need shelter. Winter is coming and a third of our homes are destroyed, but I know where there are caves, stable ones, that can house families temporarily while we rebuild. Third, we need to inventory our remaining food supplies and ration them carefully. The grain storage is gone, but many homes still have their winter stores." As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, more confident. The villagers listened with an attention they had never given her before, hanging on every word, finally understanding that the wisdom they had dismissed was exactly what would save them. "We'll need a medical station. I have herbs that can treat injuries and prevent infection. I'll need people to help me gather more from the areas that weren't affected by the slide." She paused, looking around at all of them. "But most importantly, we need to work together. No more judging people by their height or their strength or their appearance. We need everyone's skills now. The baker knows food preparation, the carpenter knows construction, the shepherds know the mountain paths. Everyone has something valuable to offer, if we're willing to listen." Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a lesson wrapped together. Marcus nodded slowly, then more firmly. "You're right," he said. "You're absolutely right. What do you need us to do?" What followed were the hardest weeks of Amara's life, but also the most fulfilling. She organized the villagers into teams, using everyone's strengths. She led expeditions to the spring, marking a safe path through the debris. She found the caves she had scouted months ago and helped turn them into comfortable temporary shelters. She set up her medical station and treated everyone from small cuts to broken bones, her knowledge of herbs proving invaluable. But more than her actions, it was her spirit that inspired the villagers. Despite everything they had done to her, she worked tirelessly to help them. She didn't hold grudges or seek revenge. She simply led with quiet competence and genuine care for their well-being. Slowly, the village began to recover. Slowly, the villagers began to change. Gregor, who had mocked her height, now worked alongside her every day, following her instructions without complaint. He even apologized, a halting, awkward apology that brought tears to his eyes. "I was taught that size meant strength," he told her one evening as they prepared medical supplies. "I'd never thought about what real strength looked like. I'm sorry for everything." Helena resigned from the council and spent her days helping Amara gather herbs, learning the knowledge she had once dismissed as worthless. "Teach me," she asked one morning. "Please, I want to understand what I was too blind to see before." The children of the village began following Amara around, asking questions, listening to her stories, treating her with the respect she had always deserved. Parents watched their children and felt ashamed that it had taken a disaster for them to see what their children now saw so clearly. 3 months after the mudslide, the village held a special gathering. They had rebuilt enough to be stable, though full recovery would take years. Marcus stood before the community, no longer on an elevated platform, but on the same level as everyone else. "We owe our lives to someone we treated shamefully," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Someone we judged by her size instead of her character. Someone who had every reason to abandon us, but chose to save us instead. Amara, would you please come forward?" Amara stepped forward, still small, still reaching only to the shoulders of those around her, but somehow seeming to stand taller than anyone else. "We want you to lead us," Marcus said simply, "not as a council member, but as our chief advisor, the one we turn to when we need wisdom, the one we listen to, if you'll accept." Amara looked at the faces around her, faces that now held genuine respect, genuine gratitude, genuine understanding. She thought about refusing, about protecting herself from potential future hurt, but she also thought about what she had learned, that forgiveness was its own kind of strength, that people could change, that building something better was always worth the risk. "I accept," she said, "on one condition, that we teach our children and ourselves that worth is not measured in height or strength or appearance. It's measured in compassion, in wisdom, in the willingness to help others even when it's difficult. Can we agree to that?" The crowd erupted in agreement, voices overlapping, people nodding vigorously. And for the first time in her life, Amara felt truly seen. The village of Thornvale survived and eventually thrived. They rebuilt stronger, with better planning, with systems in place to protect against future disasters. But more than that, they rebuilt their values. They learned to listen to all voices, to value all contributions, to understand that strength comes in countless forms. And at the heart of it all was a small woman who had once been their joke, but had become their salvation. Not because disaster made her someone different, but because disaster had forced them to see who she had always been. They had laughed at her height, but in the end, it was her heart, her courage, and her wisdom that had saved them all. And they would never forget that lesson again. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when someone surprised you with their strength. Let's celebrate the heroes hiding in plain sight.